Out of all the major release games that I've played in my life, I don't think there's one that I've played from start to finish nearly as many times as Resident Evil 4, nor have I ever bought the same game so many times. On GameCube, I played through the game a single time, and on PlayStation 2, Nintendo Wii, and PlayStation 3, I've 100%ed just about everything on each console, and I've completed yet another playthrough for the sake of this review. That alone should show how I feel about Resident Evil 4. I believe that it deserves to be known as one of the all-time classic video games that manages to hold up nearly 2 decades later. The 6th generation of consoles had a lot of hard hitters, but Resident Evil 4 really stands out. The story follows after the events of Resident Evil 2 and 3, and seems to mostly ignore Code Veronica. Leon Scott Kennedy is now a Special Forces agent directly tasked with protecting the US president and his family. After the president's daughter Ashley is kidnapped by a mysterious organization, Leon follows a lead to rescue her in a small rural village somewhere in the middle of Spain. It doesn't take long for Leon to find that the villagers are all essentially zombies, albeit with a much higher level of intelligence than usual, being able to communicate, form strategies, and even wield complex weaponry. Throughout the adventure, Leon learns the truth behind the kidnappers, the latest zombie virus, he meets up with old friends, and generally has a wisecracking good time.
Okay, I have only one very important question. You got a smoke?
Got gum.
While the plot may be simple, the characters and dialogue are great. The voice acting is well done, and you can tell that everyone was just having a good time playing their parts.
Mr. Kennedy, don't you know when it's time to throw in the towel?
No! Leon!
Where's the satisfying sound of one's impalement?
Don't fall for this old trick.
How dare you! No more games! Kill him! Kill!
The pacing is a little silly. Ashley keeps getting re-kidnapped constantly, but you're often going to new areas and seeing new things, so it hardly even matters that they're always moving the goalposts like that. Most importantly, Resident Evil 4 has a great 1980s, 1990s action movie vibe going for it. There's plenty of gung-ho machismo set alongside really dumb jokes that I can't help but laugh at.
Ah, I have an idea. Since you're here, why don't I introduce you to it? It should keep you busy.
Can't remember the name, huh? A senior moment, perhaps.
Oh. Enjoy the fun.
Out of all the Resident Evil games I've played, this one's the most lighthearted and the most fun.
Small world, eh? Well, I see that the president's equipped his daughter with ballistics, too.
How rude! And I don't believe there's any relevance with my figure and my standing. Who are you?
Oh, excuse me, Your Highness.
It can be very gruesome at times, it is a horror game after all, but it only takes itself as seriously as it needs to while ensuring that the audience has a great time from start to finish. Graphically, it's showing its age a bit by now, but it still looks pretty good. The facial expressions and motion capture animations help make each character seem really lively. No one looks too wooden or robotic, it comes across pretty well. The texture work is a little rough. Everything looks very muddy and blurry. Like, it's fine at a glance, but trying to see anything up close isn't too good. Considering how big the game is and its variety of environments, I am willing to give this aspect a bit of a pass. The audio deserves special mention. Good music, nothing amazing, but good all the same, It mostly plays in the background as cool ambiance, and some of the action tracks are fun to listen to. What's really worth mentioning are the sound effects and gameplay dialogue. Most of the enemies have tells for when they're nearby and are about to attack you. Whether it's some manic laughter as they approach you from behind, some disgruntled groaning as they pick themselves up off the ground, or a simple yelling and pointing to alert everyone around them. Most of the enemies actually speak in Spanish, and you'll hear the phrase, "I'm right behind you, imbecile," all the time. All of these sounds are pretty intuitive to understand. They get repeated enough to the point that you easily associate certain sounds with their appropriate meaning, but not enough so that it gets annoying either. And the audio is never muffled or difficult to understand, at least not unintentionally. Granted, it helps that I've played the game so much, and I can actually speak some Spanish, but I feel like a particularly good job was done with the audio here. You're able to get a good lay of the land and a heads up on the enemy's actions thanks to how well the audio is implemented. My only major complaint here is that sometimes it can be difficult to tell from what direction an audio cue is coming from. At least not without headphones, I suppose. But I'd say that this was done about as good as you can get it for the time period. The simplest way to describe the gameplay would be as a third-person shooter. And while that's not necessarily inaccurate, it is rather misleading. The most important thing to understand is that movement is extremely stiff. You can't even strafe. The movement controls are simply forwards, backwards, and turning side to side. When you aim your weapon, you're locked into place. In that sense, it's actually extremely similar to the previous Resident Evil games. They all have tank controls and aiming that locks your movement. While there are obvious differences, such as the over-the-shoulder camera and much greater freedom and precision aiming, it's clear that this was meant to be a transitionary game for a new generation of Resident Evil, and I'm shocked by how well that transition worked out. I also want to mention how simple the controls are. There are separate buttons for aiming the gun and the knife, and 2 different buttons for running and performing actions. Opening the inventory menu is also quite important, but that's really it for the most part. While looking around with the right stick can be helpful, it's not really necessary at all. The game could theoretically be pretty easily played with a Sega Genesis or Super Nintendo controller. Or, if you're especially daring, you could even play it with the fight stick. It's impressive to me how this is a fully fledged 3D action game, and it's managed to simplify its control scheme down to the bare essentials. Resident Evil 4's most iconic feature is its laser-pointed aiming system. For starters, it's awesome that the crosshair is diegetic, and it's even used in the cutscenes. While I don't mind your typical crosshair in shooter games, there's definitely something special about Resident Evil 4's gun lasers in the way that it's actually part of the game's world. That being said, how well it works is certainly debatable. You get the basic idea easily enough, but you'll need to wave the gun around a bit in order to get an understanding of where exactly you're aiming at any given time. In other words, it can be hard to get a sense of depth and perspective, especially in the heat of the moment. Thankfully, the game is pretty well balanced around this and other aspects of the limited controls. Most enemies are slow and predictable, allowing you the time needed to line up your shot appropriately. Furthermore, you oftentimes only need one bullet. Landing a single headshot will stun an enemy and allow for a melee attack activated by a context-sensitive button prompt. This will be your go-to combo for the majority of the game. Headshot, roundhouse kick, and repeat, along with knifing the enemy on the ground when it's safe to do so. It's a simple yet very satisfying combat loop. And there's a bit of risk versus reward for trying to set up a crowd-clearing roundhouse kick in the middle of a group of enemies. Shooting various limbs also comes with various effects, like a shot to the arm makes the enemy drop their weapon, while a shot to the leg will have them fall to the floor. It's pretty impressive, and I'm not sure that this is something that's often seen or emphasized in games, even today. Aside from the Metal Gear Solid series, I can't really think of another major example that utilizes limb targeting as a major game mechanic this well. The fun combat is helped along by the enemy roster. While you'll face a garden variety of zombie most of the time, little differences such as weapons and armor go a long way to keeping the battles exciting. You'll especially want to keep an eye out for enemies with ranged weapons, but even then you'll treat throwing hatchets, crossbows, and dynamites all differently. And that's on top of the random mutations to help mix things up a bit further. Actual different enemies are few and far between. The Garador is one of my favorites, but he only shows up a grand total of 3 times. However, there are enough bosses and mini-bosses sprinkled throughout the game that you'll always be surprised by something new. There's surprisingly great variety in the weapons as well, despite the mostly conventional firearms on offer. While most guns just offer stat differences, such as attack power, magazine size, and reload speed, there's also guns that just straight up play differently. The Punisher handgun is capable of shooting through 2 zombies at once, which might make for a potentially interesting crowd control option. The 2 sniper rifles and 2 magnums have such drastic differences in attack power versus speed, and the final shotgun's colossal capacity sets it apart from the rest. Then there's the Mine Thrower, making its return from Resident Evil 3 as a particularly unique weapon. All of this is supported by the merchants scattered throughout the world, offering new weapons and upgrades throughout Leon's adventure. With 5 handguns, 3 shotguns, and a bunch of other weapons, there's a decent reason to replay this game just to see how the different gear can fare. I, for one, have still never bothered to use the TMP submachine gun, but I keep hearing great things about it. Maybe if I ever replay this game again, I'll finally do a playthrough where I give it a chance. Aside from the laser pointer, Resident Evil 4's other major noteworthy feature is escorting Ashley. It sure is ambitious to take a gameplay mechanic that's often ridiculed and reviled in the industry and make it a focus of the game, but it turned out pretty dang well. Ashley sticks close to Leon and rarely gets in the way. If you need to aim past her, Ashley will automatically crouch down. A single button press tells her to wait in place or to follow you. Overall, she manages to feel like a natural addition to the game. In truth, she only seems to be in the game for about a quarter of the time. She gets kidnapped so often that she's only really present for about half the game, and even then, for half of that time, a dumpster is provided to keep her out of the way entirely for that arena. But the times when she needs to be actively defended are handled pretty well. The level design is solid too. The game is mostly made up of dedicated arenas broken up by smaller hallways and less substantial areas. Although, even these filler sections tend to have a good amount going for them. The arenas are pretty big and offer the player several routes to take while fighting the onslaught of enemies. There can be several viable strategies depending on your current loadout and your own personal playstyle. Between the enemy types, enemy placements, and level layout, there's a good amount of variety for each arena, and more than a few can be shockingly difficult. The cage with the Garador might be the most infamous one. You're in such a tight space surrounded by deadly enemies, and it really is a frustrating nightmare. For me, however, this massive room is one that I've always obsessed over. There are so many enemies and the reinforcements seem endless. Especially if it's your first time through the game, expect to die a lot. Resident Evil 4 can be quite the challenge, but it's also pretty forgiving. Checkpoints are very frequent, and both ammunition and health items are plentiful. Hell, maybe even comically so. If I wasn't such a stickler for hoarding my supplies and relying on the handgun so much, and if I were more liberal with my shotgun, I'm sure I could have had a much easier time. The bosses are so awesome. I'd count enemies like El Gigante and the God of the Ors as more mini-bosses since you fight them multiple times, although they're still really cool, but the main bosses are where it's at. They each have their own mechanics and arenas, and they don't fight at all like regular enemies. It's a combination of your usual fast reflexes, along with trying to solve a combat puzzle of sorts, all while adhering to the already established controls. The exception is the first boss, Del Lago, which is more of a set piece than anything else, but the rest going forward are so cool. They can be really frustrating, but once you figure out how they work, it's satisfying to put them down. One thing I can most definitely do without, however, are the QuickTime events. To say that Resident Evil 4 is chock full of QuickTime events would be an understatement, and this aspect hasn't aged well in the slightest. I get it, it was a product of its time, and for certain games, like Shenmue, I can tolerate it a lot more, and I can see the charm it has. But for Resident Evil 4, I am so sick of this stuff. It seems like nearly every cutscene has to have one, and they get sprinkled in the middle of normal gameplay too. The boss fights with sudden QTEs are the worst. It's so lame. I just don't like them, and it's one of the harder things I've had to come back to in this game. I don't know, maybe I'll change my mind about Shenmue as well if I ever get around to reviewing that one day. Something else that's always bugged me, but now I see it as being really out of hand, is how quickly the enemy can suddenly be on top of you when they're out of sight. The zombies will often try to close the distance by running up close to you, but they'll also do this when you have your back turned, forcing you to play very carefully to avoid being ambushed. I've heard that the enemy aggression is tied to the game's frame rate, which is why it's recommended to play at a stable 30 frames per second as it was originally designed for. I think my PlayStation 3 version runs at 30 FPS, but I could be wrong, and it would explain the occasionally strange enemy behavior. I also played on the professional difficulty for this playthrough, so that might explain part of it as well. Even so, it still does work well enough and only requires the player to be a bit more on their toes. Worse than that though, you can seemingly clear out an arena, take your time exploring, and then all of a sudden you've got another 10 zombies coming after you from out of nowhere. Enemy respawns can be fine to a certain extent, but Resident Evil 4 gets pretty carried away with this at times. The game tries to surprise you a little too often with zombies suddenly appearing from behind, and while the frequent checkpoints certainly help to mitigate this, I'm still not a fan of these cheap shots, especially in a game built around such limited mobility. Another aspect that I can see people having a knee-jerk reaction with is the inventory management. Don't get me wrong, organizing your attaché case and making everything fit is cool and all, but I can't imagine that most people will be okay with constantly going in and out of the inventory menu mid-combat just to switch weapons or use healing items. The load times are fast enough that it doesn't really break the game's pacing, but it's still annoying to constantly go back and forth like that. It's a limitation of the hardware from back in the day that you'll have to get used to, and it's not as bad as it looks. It shouldn't be a deal breaker, but I can see most people not being happy about it, especially these days. But now there's arguably Resident Evil 4's most controversial feature, the dynamic difficulty. Others have discussed this to death in the past, but for the unaware, the basic idea is this. If the player does well, obtaining high accuracy, dealing good damage, and avoiding hits, then enemies will start to scale up, requiring more punishment to put down, and item rewards will be lessened. If the opposite occurs, If the player has poor accuracy, receives damage, or dies too often, then enemy aggression will be lowered, item rewards are improved, and in the most extreme cases, some enemies will simply be removed from certain areas entirely. This can end up creating drastically different scenarios for the player. Remember that massive room that I hate so much? Apparently, the dynamic difficulty can just remove these two crossbow snipers if you die enough. Things like this can radically change the experience for each player. I can only imagine two friends discussing the game and each one talking about how one room or the other was so much easier or so much harder in their experience, or how one strategy would be unnecessary or unapplicable due to the rearranged layout. Little did they know that, in truth, they weren't always playing the same game. Of course, the purpose of the dynamic difficulty was to provide a uniquely balanced campaign based on the personal skills of each individual player. That's all fine and good. I understand that the feature is well intentioned, but I've always hated the idea of a game that just ends up letting me win if I'm doing too poorly. And whenever a developer implements a feature like that, it feels like a lazy way to balance the game, as if to say, just let the AI handle the difficulty. However, and this is a crazy part, Resident Evil 4's dynamic difficulty is so well hidden that it was practically unknown for years. And even today, I still wouldn't consider it as very well known. It is more well documented these days, and I hate that it's in the game with no way to turn it off, but surprisingly, I can't really pinpoint any particular moment where it takes effect. I feel like I died a pretty good amount of times, but it never seemed like the game got any easier. I sure stockpiled plenty of supplies, but it's hard for me to say if that's mostly from me being stingy or from the game being generous. I'm rambling at this point, but what I'm trying to say is that you can ignore the dynamic difficulty even if you already know it exists, and it's still really hard to see it take effect, unless you probably go out of your way to die multiple times in a row on purpose. Even though I don't like that it's in the game and it makes me second guess everything that I've done, I can't really deny how well it was implemented. I think that about covers the basic overview I have of Resident Evil 4. Good enemy variety, level designs, weapon choices, controls, audio, and so on. It's too heavy on the QuickTime events, and I'm still not happy about the dynamic difficulty, but those critiques hardly mean much standing up to everything else. On top of all that, this latest casual playthrough with plenty of exploration, taking my time, and the usual amount of deaths came to about 20 hours for me. For an action game, it's a pretty good length with a lot to see and do. And there's a bunch of optional content too. Sprinkled throughout the adventure are these shooting galleries that'll reward the player with some cash for scoring high. Nothing too major, just a fun little distraction, but that's only scratching the surface for the additional stuff that Resident Evil 4 has to offer. After you complete the main game, you'll be greeted with an assortment of side games. Assignment Ada is a short mission that tasks you with exploring a small map in the game, collecting 5 key items, and then reaching the exit. It kind of reminds me of Resident Evil 2's Extreme Battle Mode, but with only a single playable character and not nearly as expansive. But it's still pretty cool to play through once. Starting from the PlayStation 2 release and each version afterwards, the much more substantial Separate Ways gets added. This is a canonical side story that explores the events of the main game from Ada's perspective. You'll go through a total of 5 chapters. Ada has her own weapons and shops, although her selection is a lot more limited and she doesn't get any upgrades, which really takes away from a lot of the depth that the main campaign has. Still, it's a great addition that adds about another 5 or so hours of content. There's some exclusive areas and even her own unique boss fight. The whole thing is a little bit too easy, but it's still a lot of fun. But now, we finally made it to the real star of the show, Resident Evil 4's The Mercenaries. While this minigame originally got its start with Resident Evil 3, it's the Resident Evil 4 version that made it famous. The player is locked into a large arena under a time limit against an endless army of zombies, and with a task of racking up kills and attaining as high a score as possible. You need to keep moving to efficiently attain kills without dropping your combo, searching for time bonuses scattered throughout the arena, and also managing your inventory. You only start off with Leon, but attaining high scores will unlock 4 additional characters as well as more arenas. Each character has their own loadouts and melee attacks, and it's a lot of fun to learn the ins and outs of their playstyles. It's quite challenging, but so much fun to try and get a 5-star rating on every stage with every character. This mode alone can add so many hours if you can get into it. It's so awesome. My favorite Mercenaries is definitely Resident Evil 6, and I have a soft spot for Resident Evil 7's Nightmare, but this entry is fantastic too. Okay, that is finally everything I have to say about Resident Evil 4. It manages a perfect balance between horror and camp. So many elements of the gameplay work very well together. The replay value is high, the additional content is great. I love this game so much, and objectively speaking, I have so little to complain about it that I honestly think it's nearly perfect. And again, it manages to stand tall even 18 years later. The controls will take getting used to, but it's a minor hurdle considering the game's strengths. I can do without the QTEs, and the game can be pretty cheap at times, but even with these comparatively minor complaints in mind, I would consider Resident Evil 4 to be one of the all-time greats and a must-play. Thanks for watching my review on Resident Evil 4. I'm not sure when exactly, but I'll get around to reviewing the remake at some point.